Hello. Welcome. Sakofi, how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing quite well. How about you?
Yeah, doing well, thanks. Doing
Yeah.
well.
And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's session. I'll be your host for today. So, whilst we wait for others to join, I just want to say I'm grateful that you guys have joined us on this session. You definitely be amazed with what we're going to share. Over the course of the week, we'll be focusing on, over the course of multiple weeks, we'll be focusing on these study sessions to help you with your AZ 104 exams. So my good colleague here, David, will be the main speaker for this event. So over to you,
Yeah,
David.
it was very interesting, Sakofi, because we've been talking about this in our community. Hello everyone. So for those that may not be aware, so we do have a LinkedIn community group where we have about 7,000 members now. And we've been talking about this for quite a while now, right, Sakofi? We've been,
Yeah.
we've been talking about we need to do some kind of group study together. So a few weeks ago, we sort of did like a vote, and people voted for the topic that they wanted us to start with first. And the topic that came out on top was the Azure administrator, followed by the Azure architect, then followed by the Azure developer, and followed by the Azure DevOps. And we're going to be going through all these four certifications, right, over this live studies that we're going to be doing together. So, Sakofi, yeah. So, just quick one before we start. So, what are we planning to do, like in general? What are we planning to do, like for today? Like,
Yeah. So today is all about the introduction to Azure, to say. So the focus is just trying to give you a more like an overview of the whole structure of Azure, how it came to be, and various aspects. Yeah.
awesome, and yeah, and also, if you do have any questions while we go through this live certification studies, feel free to put your questions in the chat window if you're watching on LinkedIn or if you're watching on Twitch. Put your question in the chat window. We're going to get that. So that's going to come over to us on the platform that we're using to stream, and we'll be able to respond to your questions. So in the interest of time, we can go ahead and start. So Sakofi, like I didn't even ask who are you? Who are you? I keep calling you sir. So why do I call you sir?
Well, I'm not really doing the honor yet, but I'm just joking. But my name is Kofi Ade, and I'm currently a network engineer at Sophos. I've been working with David for quite some time, and he, changed from one. He actually moved to a different company essentially, but we've been planning to work together. So I have been in the IT industry for probably close to about 8 years. So I've learned a lot, and as you already know, the IT industry evolves a lot, and this is a new era whereby cloud seems to be dominating, and we see this as an opportunity for us to learn and also progress ourselves. So yeah, so that's a little bit about me. Yeah.
Awesome. And thanks very much for sharing that. Okay, so just to introduce the rest of everyone else as to what exactly we're going to be looking at in our time together. So I'll just bring this up very quickly. So we mentioned that we're going to be looking at the Azure Administrator Live Study Series. It's just 1 hour per study session. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the entire objective for that certification. So we'll start first with managing identities and governance. We'll discuss configuring and managing virtual networking for Azure. We'll look at implementing and managing storage. We'll look at deploying and managing Azure compute resources. And finally, we'll talk about monitoring and backup of Azure resources. So Sir Kofi, so these 5 areas, they align with the official Microsoft certification objectives for the Azure Administrator. So, which is a very interesting one. So, Sir Kofi, so the Azure Administrator one, because I know that you're currently preparing for an exam. Are you preparing for the Azure Administrator or for the Azure Solutions Architect?
Yeah, I'm for the solution architect.
Solutions Architect one.
Yeah.
And that's a very good point, because even though we're currently looking at the Azure Administrator for starting with that, the topics that we're going to be discussing do help you also for your preparation for the Azure Architect one. So you're going to get something useful from that. Yeah. So here are the topics in the different sections. So in the first section of managing Azure identities and governance, we'll talk about identity. So mainly Azure AD, hybrid identity. We'll talk about governance and compliance and administering Azure. Then in the second section, we're going to talk about virtual networking, inter-site connectivity, and how to manage network traffic in Azure. In the third section, we're going to look at storage. In the fourth section is going to be about virtual machines, containers, serverless computing, so things like app service and functions. And finally, we're going to look at data protection and monitoring. And we do have a very interesting plan for you. So here's the plan of what we have. So we're starting today with this one. So the Azure intro, so that is today. And over the course of a few weeks, like what Sakofi said, the plan is we're going to do 1 hour for each day, and we're going to go through like the whole course objectives for the AZ104. And at the end of that, on the 25th of May, we're going to do an exam preparation session where we're going to be testing you with a bunch of questions, and there may even be prizes for people to win. So watch out for that. So quick one also for you, Sakofi, in this particular aspect. So we're going to be looking at this course content, and that's what we're going to be discussing and looking into. We do have a special plan for people in terms of homework and labs to do. Is that something you can help to explain to people?
Yeah, so basically, the plan we have is to give some sort of like a lab test. I mean, homework essentially that you can actually follow in your own environment. You have a cloud account or subscription in for Azure, and then you can actually go through it. So the whole point is to help you to practice it, and obviously it will help you to have that experience and confidence when it comes to the cloud.
Awesome. So do watch out for that. So at the end of every study session, we'll be giving you lab homework to do. So, and the lab homework will consist of doing some hands-on, right? Hands-on is very important when doing this. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to give you the hands-on to do. We're going to also put out videos of doing the hands-on so you can follow in case you ever get stuck. And of course, if you're not yet a member of the LinkedIn community group, join the LinkedIn community group. We'll put the link in the description of this video below. If you've not yet joined the meetup group, join that. That's how we stay in touch and be able to ask questions from us. So here's the plan for what we're going to start with today. Azure overview for administrators. So Sakofi, I'll just tell you a little bit of story of how this particular section came about. Right? It's a very interesting story.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because what happens was that whenever I teach like just Azure certification and I teach people on that, I started realizing that many people did not have certain foundational information. So, and that caused a disconnect when we're talking. So whenever I'm talking about something like geo-redundant replication for Azure storage, people struggle to understand that because they are lacking some background information. So I just kept meeting that same issue over and over again. So what I decided to do was, let's flip this around. Why don't I take the things that I think that people need to know in order for them to understand the objectives that we're going to be discussing in this course? And why don't we discuss that ahead of time so that by the time we actually get into discussing the course content, people at least have some baseline knowledge that they can refer to. So that's what we're planning to do with this one. And here's what we're going to start with. So we're going to start by looking at the Azure Cloud Platform today. We're going to look at the Azure organization structure. We're going to look at the Azure Cloud Services. We're going to look at Azure Management Tools. And then we're going to give you the lab and the homework to do today. So here's a trick question for you, Sakofi. Here's a trick question. And feel free to ask me any question, of course, at any time. So here's a trick question for you. So the Azure Cloud, like how many clouds is the Azure Cloud? It's a trick one.
How many clouds?
Yeah, exactly. So the Azure Cloud, how many clouds is it?
Yeah, I think probably about 6, depending on the other country own private cloud?
I think you're right, Kofi. So I think you're absolutely right. So the Azure cloud, when many people think of Azure, they think Azure is a single cloud platform. So, but the truth is the Azure cloud platform is not a single cloud platform. It's actually multiple cloud platforms. Like what Kofi said, it could be 6, depending on what you're counting. It could be 5, depending on what you're counting. But the Azure cloud platform, if we say at the baseline, has multiple clouds. So we have the Azure public cloud. So that's probably the one that many people know. Many people know about the Azure public cloud, right? So that's the one that anyone can just use their credit card or debit card or whatever. You can go over, sign up for an Azure account, and you can begin to deploy services. So that's available for everyone. So that's the Azure public. But there are also other Azure cloud, like the Azure US government cloud. So this one is a very interesting one. So in order for you to sign up, for you to gain access to the Azure US government cloud, it's not the same process that you follow when you want to gain access to this cloud. It's a completely different process, of course. So with the Azure US government, you have to provide proof to Microsoft that you're a US government entity. In other words, you have to provide proof that you belong to a US government, and whether it's federal government, state government, local government, or you have to provide proof that you work with a software vendor that supplies software to a US government entity, or you have to provide proof that you are a commercial entity that handles special US government data. So maybe if you're handling data like the criminal justice data or weapons information data for like the Ministry of Defense for US, you have to provide proof before you get access to this particular Azure cloud. But it exists. It's right there.
All right, so this cloud is not just the US government. Other persons that are actually American citizens can actually apply for it.
Yes, including software vendors. So for example, so both of us, we both work for software vendors, right? So you work for a software vendor, I work for a software vendor. So our companies supply software to US government, right? And in order for them to be able to meet certain requirements, they have to host the platform that's providing that software on a compliant platform. So they can go to Microsoft and say, hey, we want to supply the US federal government with our software hosted on Azure. We need access. Microsoft verifies that, and then they give the company access to deploy to the Azure US government cloud. So it's a very interesting one, right? And this one, Sarkophit, this is another interesting one. So this one used to confuse me in the past because Microsoft just used to call it Azure government. And then you begin to think, oh, okay, that's talking about the Azure Ghanaian government or the Azure Nigerian government or the Azure UK government. But actually, it's only just talking about the Azure US government, not for government of the world. So maybe they're going to extend it later. So the other cloud that exists is the Azure Gemini cloud, right? And that's a very interesting one because Gemini does have like a very strict requirement when it comes to how data must be handled. And what they've done here is they have a company called T-Systems. And what T-Systems do is that they oversee Microsoft's activity for Azure Gemini. So in other words, if Microsoft says, hey, I need to access this customer's data, Microsoft has to submit a request to T-Systems who are going to ensure that the data that Microsoft wants to access is in line with the German law. So this is to prevent, the US FBI or whatever getting access to the citizens of Germany's data. So essentially, they have like this oversight, this company that oversees what Microsoft are doing with customers' data and such. So it's a very interesting one, right? And there is the Azure China platform also. So that's a different cloud platform. So the Azure China one, it works a bit differently than these other ones. So how it works is that there is a company called 21 ViaNet, and 21 ViaNet essentially hosts Azure China. So this is different from what T-Systems do for Azure Germany. T-Systems just oversees what Microsoft does. Whereas for this one, this is the company that actually hosting Azure China, on behalf of Microsoft. So it's a different model, right, for different countries. And you can see all the different regions. So this has 42 regions, this has 7 regions, this has 2 regions, this has 4 regions. Microsoft they've currently announced 11 regions, and part of that includes I believe 2 secret regions for US government. So they're not going to announce the location, they just exist somewhere. So they're not going to announce it. And finally, we have another one, so we can move on. So let's go erase that. Finally, there is the Azure Stack Hub. So this is self-hosted. So this is where a customer can get like a Microsoft certified hardware from a vendor like HP or Lenovo. So it's a hyper-converged hardware. And that hyper-converged hardware is actually running the same software that's running the Azure platform, but you're running that in your own private data center. So they call that Azure Stack Hub or Azure Stack Hub and HCI. So that's sort of like the way that is.
All right. So what Azure Stack that is available for everyone essentially?
No. Yeah, good question, Sakofi. So it's available for everyone, but not everyone has deep enough pocket for it, if that makes sense. So it's like, yep, you can go ahead and buy it if you want to, but there is cost. Of course, it's going to be running in your data center, so you have your data center space. It's going to need cooling and all the other stuff, but that's sort of like the way that stuff works. So it's available to everyone, but you have to, essentially, you get hardware. So you get like a whole rack of hardware. It has compute, it has storage. It's running the same software that's running the Azure platform. So when you set it up, you can actually log into it, and it has a field to hit like the Azure portal. So there's a lot of things that we can talk about that, but we'll probably talk about it some other lessons.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And also, here's what makes these cloud platforms different is that these platforms are isolated from each other. So the Azure public regions are connected together, but they are not connected to the US government. So that's isolated from each other. And you can see if you want to manage resources in Azure Public, you go to portal.azure.com, Azure US Government, portal.azure.us, Azure Germany, portal.microsoftazure.de, and Azure China, portal.azure.cn. So let's go ahead and do a bit of demo here. Let's go to grab, I go to the Azure portal. And apologies, yes, Coffee, because I should have this one up and running, but unfortunately, I didn't have it up and running. So I'll just quickly log into my Azure portal and just show you where we can get some of this information of the things that we've talked about so far. So let's go to David. And let's put in the password. So hopefully my subscription is still active with this one. Subscription, please be active. Please, you're not disabled yet. Please. Yeah, it's still active. So Kofi, we're doing good today. By the way, how are you getting on with your Sakofi has like a bouncing baby boy? How's it doing?
Yeah, it's doing quite well.
Is it learning AWS, Azure?
I think people are complaining my sound has some feedback. Let me see if I can handle that.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. I think I can notice that there's a bit of it. It's a bit cracking a little bit. So it's tough. So for a multimillionaire like Sakofi, that's unusual. Okay, so while Sakofi is sorting out the mic, I'll just show you like how to get some of the information that we talked about. So for example, if I'm currently in the cloud shell, if I do AZ cloud list, and I output my results to a table. So let me bring that up a bit so to help you see that clearer. So hopefully you can see the screen. So you can see that right now I'm using the Azure cloud, which is the Azure public cloud, but you can see there's Azure China, there's Azure US government, there's Azure German cloud that exists. So, and if I want to see sort of like the endpoint, the management endpoint for each of the cloud, I can do AZ cloud show. and specify the name of the cloud that I want to show. So let's take Azure Cloud, for example, here. And here you can see that's the management endpoint for the Azure Cloud. So you can see that's the Azure Active Directory endpoint. That's the Azure portal for it, right? And all the other different services, the API endpoint. So I can do the same thing. Let's clear the screen a bit. I can do the same thing for the other clouds, like the Azure China Cloud. And I'll get result of the endpoint. So you can see that the endpoints are different. So hopefully that makes sense. So we can move on now. So Sakofi, are you back, sir? Oh, Sakofi back. I think we lost Sakofi. Let's see. 1 minute. Let's go to see what's going on here. Oh, Sakofi, are you there? Oh, okay.
Hello?
Hello, yeah, we can hear you now. So for some reason, it froze and then we can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm still having that same issue. One moment.
Ah, okay. Okay, no problems. Oh, okay, sorry, apologies. I'll just take Sakofi to the back screen and then Sakofi will sort that out and I'll hopefully monitor the stuff. Okay, so while Sakofi is sorting that out, let's talk about this a bit more. So here's some update for you. So we talked about the Azure German Cloud. So the Azure German Cloud will be retired on the 29th of October of this year. So it's going away. So it's been around for a while, but Microsoft have finally decided they are taking it away. So one of the things that Microsoft has done in preparation for that is they've created 2 new German regions that's part of the Azure Public Cloud. So it's not isolated from the rest of the Azure Public Cloud. So essentially, customers that are currently using Azure Germany, the geo-fenced cloud, will need to migrate their services to these 2 new regions going forward. So just be aware of that update. Okay, so now that we have that information, let me just check on my body here. Let me check on Sakofi. Are you good now? Is it good? Are you back? Is your sound good?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Uh,
Oh, I think it's something to do with the microphone. So let me just need to check on the microphone a bit.
Okay.
Yeah, but actually, for me, I think it's not that bad. So I think that Sakofi, I think that really for now, I think that we can probably go on for now. I think it's not too bad. It's a bit catchy, but that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think it'll be fine. Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to what we're talking about. So now we're talking about the Azure region architecture. So we talked about like the Azure Cloud Platform. Let's look at the Azure region architecture. So here's what the Azure region architecture looks like. So when Microsoft looked at the world, Microsoft divided the world into what they call geographies. So the world, according to Microsoft, is divided into geographies. So Sakofi, was geography one of your cool subjects when you were in school? You were like a
Not really.
Yeah, so same here a little bit. And I had like a great geography teacher. I just wasn't listening. So unfortunately. So, but what Microsoft did here is they took the whole world and they said, we're going to divide the world into geographies. But geographies in Microsoft definition is different from geography that we learned in school. So here's Microsoft definition of a geography. Microsoft definition of a geography is a data residency and a compliance boundary. So that's Microsoft definition of a geography. What that means is Microsoft looks at the world and they say, okay, this section of the world, they have a different data residency requirement. That's going to be a geography, right? This section of the world, they have a different data residency requirement, and Microsoft made them a geography, right? So, and on and on. So that's sort of like what Microsoft did is they took the world, they divided the world into geographies, right? So that's how they've done that. So, and let's move on here. So for example, if we look at the way the whole thing works, Canada is a geography, US is a geography, Mexico is a geography, UK is a geography, Germany, France, Spain, Africa is a geography, China, Japan, India, and multiple other geographies. Actually, there are currently about 36 geographies that Microsoft have defined. So 36 geographies. Yeah.
Essentially, there's a data center in every continent.
Yes, there is. So they do have reach in every single continent right now, right? So, and the way that they've done it is, again, they took the world, they divided the world into geographies, and that's how they've structured it. And essentially, geography is a data residency and compliance boundary. So here's the interesting thing, Sakofi. The interesting thing is, within a single country, you can have multiple geographies. So that's why I said we have to not think of geography in the same way we learned about it in school. We have to go by this definition, data residency and compliance boundary. For example, if I go forward here, the US government is a geography. So you have US is one geography, US government is a geography. So the reason for that is because US government has a different data residency and compliance requirement than the rest of US. So if we just define geography as a data residency and compliance boundary, it will help us to avoid confusion of thinking a geography is just a region in the world, because a single region can have multiple geographies if the data residency varies, right? So that's sort of like the thing there. So hopefully that makes sense. So Microsoft divided the world into geographies, and what they decided to do was to have minimum of 2 data center regions in a geography. So here's another trick question for you, Sakofi. Why do you think Microsoft decided to do this? So we're going to divide the world into geographies, and we're going to ensure that there are a minimum of 2 data center regions in a geography. Why?
I believe natural disasters or issues that might happen at one specific site. They want to cover themselves.
That's why I call you sir. Right? So everybody can see why I call him sir now. So it's essentially what Sakofi said. It's because of disaster recovery. So Microsoft said, what we want to do is we want you to be able to design for disaster recovery without breaking your compliance regulation. So imagine, Sakofi, imagine if Microsoft has only 1 data center region in UK. Now, I've put the first instance of my SQL server in that data center region. Now, I want to design for disaster recovery. If there's no other region in UK, that means I have to go put my disaster recovery instance maybe in Spain. And that's where I may be breaking a compliance regulation. So what they did is we're going to divide the world into geography, and we're going to ensure that you can design for disaster recovery within your geography. So you can stay compliant with the rules and regulation of your government while still having disaster recovery. So that's the plan there. So this is what that looks like. So we have, again, geographies, and within geographies, we have minimum of 2 regions. So, and we use the region for disaster recovery, as we said. And the regions, Microsoft try to keep them hundreds of miles apart from one another. So this is not always the case. So Sakofi, are you familiar? So for example, when in UK, are you familiar with where the UK regions are?
No, not a clue.
They have one in London. They have a region in London, and they have another region in Cardiff, I believe. So in Wales. So those are the 2 places where they have like those sort of regions and stuff. And I'll share like some documents with you. So essentially,
it was strategically positioned.
Exactly. So for example, so most likely, so if you think about it, so I'll bring up another one. So essentially what they're trying to do is to ensure that they're in different flood and fault zones. So if something is affecting London, except it's a massive disaster, it probably won't, get to Wales, right, in Cardiff. And if something is affecting London and Cardiff at the same time, a disaster, then we'll probably Azure will probably be like the least of our worries. Right. So they have different. So they essentially try to make sure that they are on different hurricane zones, electrical grid, and all that stuff. So that's the plan for that. And then what they also do is they group the regions into peers. So that's also very important. So this is the concept of paired region. We'll talk about it in later sessions that we do together. So paired regions is where Microsoft decided we're going to have low latency network connectivity between 2 regions in the same geography, usually, And the reason for that is for platform service replication. So here's what this means, Kofi. Here's what that means. Let me go to the Azure portal now. If I go to the Azure portal and I go to create a new storage account, so let's go create a resource. And by the way, please do leave your question in the chat window. If you have a question, put it in the chat window. We'll bring up your question and we'll answer your question. No problems. Yeah, so we'll bring up your question if you have any questions. So put your question in the chat window, please. So let's go to over here. So I'm creating a storage account here. One of the options that I have when I'm creating a storage account is this option here called redundancy. If I select geo redundant storage, right? So what that means is the data that I store in the storage account will be replicated into another region in the same geography. So which other region will my data be replicated into? My data will be replicated into the paired region of the region that I selected. So that's sort of like the way that works. So, but within our regions, we have something called availability zones. And availability zones are just groups of data centers within the region. So they're isolated from each other. So for example, availability zones within a region, they have different water supplies, different power lines, different network, different generators. So essentially, the whole idea behind it is if you want to design for high availability, you can use availability zones within a region. If you want to design for disaster recovery, you can use regions. So that's the plan. So that way, if I have multiple instances of my SQL Server, I can put one instance of my SQL Server here, another instance of my SQL Server here. They are in the same region. The regions are connected to one another. If something affects this data center, hopefully it doesn't extend enough to where it affects this data center so that my instance will still be running. So that's the plan, is to ensure that we can have this isolated data centers within a single region. So let me check. I think there's something that's come up now. Yeah. Okay. So let's see where we are now. So hopefully that makes sense to you, ladies and gentlemen. So here's this thing. So I'm about to give you a little bit of bad news here. So the little bit of bad news is that availability zones, it's not currently supported in every single region in Azure. At the moment, it's only supported, I believe, in 17 of the regions. So Azure currently has about, I believe, if you had all the regions that they've announced, they have about 65 regions in total, right? 17 of them support availability zones at the moment. What Microsoft plans, or what they've promised, is that by the end of the year 2021, there will be 3 availability zones for every geography. So that's what Microsoft has promised for this year, is that for every geography, there will be availability zones that for at least one of the regions in that geography. So let's go over to just share that information with you so that you can always refer back to this. And let's go to bring that up. So we've been talking about this for a while. So this document, for example, shows us like the geographies that exist. So you can see we are on the geographies. You can see the different geographies that exist over here, right? So if I go to South Africa, for example, or just Africa, for example, we have the South Africa one, and you can see all the other different ones. You can see that some of them, they've just announced them, they are coming soon. You can see this as availability zones with 3 zones. You can essentially switch back and forth and see the different regions and whether they have zones or not. So you can see that this currently does not have any availability zones. However, there is another region within that geography that has availability zones. So it's not yet supported in every single region. So just be aware of that. So one other useful information, I think that there's something that's coming up. So I'm not sure if that's a question from someone. So let's see. Is there a question from someone? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Apologies. I'm missing. Hey, hello, everyone. Oh, okay. Oh, I've just seen all the different questions from someone. So let me bring that up. Let me bring that up a bit. So let's see some of the questions. It's okay. Yeah, we'll come back to that. So Satish said US government geography has separate regions and peers, right, sir? Yes, that's true. So US government geography, it has its own regions. It has 7 regions the last time that I counted it. So it has 7 regions and it has different peers. So, okay, yeah, I can see people answering my question about HA. Well done. So apologies for missing your chat messages. I will monitor this going forward. Awesome. Well done. Thanks very much. So one other thing to mention here is that what Microsoft has also decided to do is when it comes to availability zones, just be aware that availability zone 1 in UK does not always mean availability zone 1 for every subscription. What do I mean by that? So let's say we have customer 1 and customer 1 has a subscription, and then there's customer 2 and customer 2 has a subscription. So usually when many people are provisioning their resources, people will probably just select AZ1 and everybody will just keep selecting AZ1 to where this availability zone gets overloaded. So to avoid that, Microsoft randomizes. So what they've done is they've randomized availability zones per subscription. So for example, in subscription for this customer, availability zone 1 is this. However, in the subscription of this customer, availability zone 1 is that. So that way, it's not as if whenever this customer selects availability zone 1, it's all going to the same one. So for this customer, availability zone 1 is that. For this customer, availability zone 2 is that. For this customer, availability zone 3 is this one. For this customer, availability zone 3 is this one. So essentially, to avoid a situation where we have hot zones where people are just selecting availability zone 1 and we just overload it, Microsoft have decided to randomize availability zones per subscription. So just be aware of that. So if you say, oh, okay, so my computer is in, my virtual machine is in availability zone 1, just put your own in availability zone 1 so they'll be close to one another. It doesn't work that way. So they're randomized. That's the way that works. Okay, so let's go forward now. Oh, I'm missing Sir Kofi a lot. Sir Kofi, where are you? Are you back? Oh, I think Sir Kofi is back.
Yeah,
hello.
I think it's...
Awesome. Welcome back. People have missed you a lot. You see, like everyone is like, hey,
I think it's still okay.
Yeah, welcome back, man. Welcome back. So let's move on so we can catch up with the things that we've discussed so far. So and then we can bring this one. So yeah, let me show you some pictures of what like the Azure data centers look like. So for example, here is the example of a region, of an Azure region in Quincy, and you can see how large that is. So here's an example of one in Wyoming, and similar one. So that's one in Dublin, Ireland, and that's same one in Dublin, Ireland. That's Amsterdam in Netherlands. So essentially, and you can also see that they're building like because Microsoft, I think what Microsoft has promised that by the year 2025. They want all their Azure data centers to be completely be running on renewable energy. So that's the promise that they've made. Is that by the year 2025? So you can see that they have like all these wind turbines over here. So that's what that looks like. Yeah.
Is there any redundancy in terms of structure? I mean, for example, electricity and other stuff.
Good question. So yes. So at every layer there is redundancy. However, as we carry on with our studies, so when we finish like the Azure Administrator, when we get to the Azure Architecture, we'll even talk about that because when it comes to redundancy, in some cases, some of it is by default. In some cases, what Microsoft has done is they've given us options. So for example, in a particular geography, they'll have 2 regions, right? So it's your responsibility as a customer to now ensure that you distribute your disaster recovery into the other region, if that makes sense. So in some cases, it's by default. In some cases, they make the option available, but now it's in your hands to follow good practice. Does that make sense, Kofi?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So here's another interesting one. Let me share some very interesting things that Microsoft has been working on. So this one has been around for a while. So they call it Project Natic. So this is where they're essentially building data center and then putting this under the water. So they're sinking this under the water. And they've run this for like a while now successfully. So, and it's a very interesting one to where essentially they're exploring running the data centers of the coast under the water. So it's interesting what innovation people think about, right? So, and they've got that, and that's that's a video of them thinking that, but then they also have like a video of. So here's what that looks like. Look at that, Sakofi. So this is like a live video feed. Of course, this is not live right now as we're speaking, but this is like a video feed of that running under the water. And then they're using Azure Cognitive Services, which when we talk about that, when we get to the Azure AI study sessions. So they're using Azure Cognitive Services to identify, object and items, so they're identifying fish. So I do have a I do have a question, Sakofi. So do you think that if a human dresses as a fish, do you think this AI will identify it?
Well, I guess AI has probably in mind.
I'm not too sure. It'd be like a nice experiment. Just dress like a whale, you look exactly like a whale and see if it's going to identify it. I don't think so. I'm not sure.
So what is the purpose of this, essentially?
Oh, sorry. Oh, you mean like, yeah. So essentially it's just to see like whether they can effectively run this off the coast. So for example, I think this probably are much more, they run it in much more renewable way. The way that they run them, and they don't have to use space and land and all that stuff. So that's one of the things that they're exploring. Another one that they have, which I don't have a slide for, is something called Azure Modular Data. Modular Data Center. So this is where Kofi, a man of your status and stature, with your level of money and millions, you can essentially say, Microsoft, can you please deliver a data center to my house? Right? My son wants to, do some Azure and stuff. And then you essentially have like this modular Azure data center delivered to you. So they put it on the back of a truck and they deliver it to like, a region. And then it also has SATCOM for satellite connectivity. So essentially can connect straight using the satellite. So for example, if you think about things like humanitarian efforts, where people are in regions where there's not that network connectivity, it can just use the satellite to connect. So it has its own network, it has its own storage, it has its own HVAC for cooling. So it has all of that. Essentially, it's just a modular data center that you can move around. And then again, combine that with Azure Space, which allows you to extend satellite connectivity to that.
So essentially, this one is like AWS mobile, Snowball mobile.
It's not the same thing. So the other one, so we'll get to that later. So the Snowball is if you want to copy data into AWS, right?
Yeah.
But what this one is this one is not just about data, it's about compute and data. So essentially, you can say, so essentially when you deliver this, it's running the same software that's running Azure. You can connect to this and you can say, I want to deploy a Kubernetes cluster on this.
Right.
So, and you can run it in a connected mode or in a disconnected mode. If you run it in a connected mode, then you can sort of synchronize between it and the Azure cloud, the public Azure cloud. If you run it in a disconnected mode, it's just your own private Azure cloud. You connect to it using a similar, so essentially it's running the same thing that's running Azure.
Right. What about the cost involved?
Sorry?
The cost.
Oh yeah, people like you, actually, that's nothing to you. That's nothing to you, man. Sakofi, it's like, nothing. Just put it on the back of a truck, they deliver it to you. It'll probably be a lot expensive, especially if you consider that you may also, depending on where you're shipping it to, you may need to pay for like satellite connectivity also with SATCOM. Essentially, the use case is about humanitarian assistance, military mission field. Those people, essentially those remote cases where there's no fast network, but you want to bring your compute close to you. That's what this is for.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on and then we'll round off and then we give people some homework to do. So in order for us to be able to use all this amazing infrastructure that we've talked about, right, all these geographies and regions and all these different clouds, in order for us to be able to use them, there are two main things that we need to start with. We need an Azure AD tenant and we need an Azure subscription. That's what we need. Okay, you want to start deploying things into this Azure platform, you only need two things. You need an Azure AD tenant, you need an Azure subscription. The Azure AD tenant is where your identities live. So your users, your groups, your service principles, which is identity for application, your managed identity, which is identity for resources in Azure. So all these different identities live in Azure AD tenant. But then your resources that you're deploying, so things like your SQL server, your virtual machines, your app services, your virtual networks, all these different services lives in an Azure subscription. So you need an Azure AD tenant for your identity for authentication, and you need an Azure subscription, which is where your resources will live. And then there is a trust relationship between your Azure subscription and the Azure AD tenant. So that this way, whenever a user wants to access resources in your Azure subscription, or maybe access your Azure subscription, they will be authenticated by Azure AD, which gives them a token. If the token checks out, then they can essentially go provision resources in Azure. So that's how it works.
So can you have multiple subscription linked to the tenant?
Good question. And the answer to that is yes. And that's what you see many organizations do. So they will have multiple subscriptions all linked to the same Azure AD tenant. So maybe this can be the subscription where they deploy their production workload. So maybe it's locked down a bit more. This can be the one where they deploy their test workloads, right? Maybe for development and tests, and they can have multiple subscriptions all linked to the same Azure AD tenant. And if in the future they decide and say, we actually want to go create another Azure AD tenant, they can do that. So they can go create another Azure AD tenant and move this trust relationship to that tenant. So let me show you where that configuration information would be. So for example, I have my Azure subscription over here. And if I go to my Azure subscription, you see here that it says change directory. I won't change it, but if you have a look, you can see that it's linked to my Azure AD tenant, which is called the default directory. So this is my Azure subscription, and my Azure subscription trusts this default directory. The Azure AD tenant itself, it's over here. So this is my Azure AD tenant, and I've got my users and everything over here. So this is what that looks like. So yeah, and to answer your question even further, Sir Kofi, because once an organization starts adding more subscriptions, right, and they keep adding more and more and more subscription, then they can get into something called a subscriptions pro, which is they get into a situation like this. Now you have 100 subscriptions that's linked to the same Azure AD tenant, and it's very difficult to manage this. So imagine, Sir Kofi, imagine you have the task of managing 100 subscriptions, and you have to configure policies individually on each one of them. How painful would that be, right? Yeah. So it's like, oh, I've got to go configure my policy over here and who has access over here. And I'm going to do that for 100 of them, and I'm going to keep them up to date and monitor all of them. So that can be a bit
overcome this.
Yeah, very good question. Because this was a challenge initially, but what Microsoft did was they've solved that in a different way. So the Azure organization structure that I showed you earlier, that's not actually complete. This is the complete Azure organization structure. You have your Azure AD tenant with your identities. And then what you can do is you can enable something called a root management group. The root management group will now become sort of like the top level organization for your Azure resources. And then under that, you can start having child management groups. So what you can then do is you can take, your subscriptions, 50 of them, you can group them under this child management group. And then all you just need to do is you configure the policy once over here, and that's going to go to all of them, right? And then you can go create another child management group over here, right? And then you can have maybe 5 subscriptions over here linked to that. And then you can configure your policy over here. So that's how you can overcome that, is you use management group to group your subscription together, and then you can manage them at a higher level. Does that make a bit of sense?
Yeah.
And then we have our subscriptions under that, and then we have our resource groups, and then we have our resources. So now that's what it looks like. So we have this. And if we want to give permission to anyone in Azure AD, we assign Azure AD roles to them. If we want to give permission to anyone to Azure resources on any of this level, we assign Azure role-based access control roles to them. So we'll talk about those later. So, but the main thing to know is that they are different to each other. The fact that I've given Sir Kofi permission here does not mean that you have permission to do anything here. So Azure AD and the Azure resources have different permission models. So let's look at the time and then let's bring this to a close here because we're running towards the end of our 1 hour session. So let's just talk about one more thing and then we'll round up. So here's one other thing, the services that we can deploy in Azure. What services can we deploy? So now we started with what does the platform look like? We talked about how we gain access to the platform by getting our Azure subscription, right? And then we talk about how we can manage that using management group. So what services can we deploy on that? So Sir Kofi, here's another tricky question for you. Can you guess how many services does Azure currently have right now?
Well, I guess kind of even imagine it. I think it's a lot, right? Probably more than
Probably more than what did you say?
more than 20.
More than 20. Let's go. Definitely more than 20. Let's go have a quick look and see if we can find it together. Let's go see the comment, if we can find the current number. So I'll run some commands here. So let's go. Let me switch over to PowerShell and let's run some commands. Let's see if we can find the number of services that we have for Azure subscription. So for example, like what I'm doing here is not like the most ideal way, but usually what I'm doing here is I'm going to this web page. So this web page contains a list of all the Azure services. If I go to this web page, you can see all the different categories. Look at that. Look at all the different categories of Kofi. And under each category, look at the services. So just under AI and machine learning, you have anomaly detector, you have face API, custom vision, computer vision. So you have this just under AI and machine learning. Then you go under compute. Look at the different ways to consume compute on Azure. App service, function, quantum, in preview, VMware solution, Kubernetes, API hub, container instances, lots of them. Right? You want to work with developer tools, the different developer tools that exist. So you can see that there's a lot of services that exist. But let's see if we can count them very quickly. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly go to that URL and I'll put that in a variable, get the members, and let's remove all the duplicates so we only count the unique services. So here are all the services that we have. So, and it's unique. So it's listed all of them. So here are the services that we have in Azure. So let's go count them. Let's clear the screen and let's count them. Let's run the same thing, same command, and I'll just put count at the end. And that's 175.
Wow.
So that's, yeah. So whenever, yeah, sorry, Sakofi, I didn't hear what you said.
I said the number goes up almost every year.
Yep, exactly. And you're right. So for example, right now, right, let me see if there's any question and comment in the chat window. So for example, right now, there is Microsoft Ignite happened earlier this year. There is Microsoft Build Conference that will happen in May, which is the one targeted at developers. So Sakofi and we both need to be there. So we both need to be on that conference. Okay, so someone says, can you please confirm course fee? Oh, okay, let's see some questions in the chat window. Let's see. Could you please send that link to check the Azure geography? Yes. So link to check the Azure geography. Hopefully if I put that in here, hopefully that gets to you. So I've just put that in the chat window. So hopefully that if that does not get to you, I'll put it in the description of this video and you can always come back to it. So no problems. So let's see any other question that exists. So, okay, so someone made a comment and said, water is usually colder, so it's much cheaper air conditioned bill. So the person, essentially, you're trying to blame Microsoft that they're just looking to save money, right? So Ramke says, how much cost? I'm not sure, Ram, what you mean by how much cost. Are you talking about the cost of the money for what? So, so Nehemiah says that is interesting. I'm not sure if that is secure. Anyone can grab and destroy it. So you're talking about the one under the water, right? Yeah. So there's definitely challenges that's in there, right? So but again, it depends. You have no idea like how much they've reinforced the steel that they've used to build that, right? And what level of security that they have. Like they have live video feeds. They're using AI to identify if there's any intrusion. So those kind of stuff. But I see what you mean in terms of the risk, right, Sakofi? Because that is a bit risky, right?
Yeah.
Because if your data center gets cut off under the sea.
I bet they might have some sensors around just in case someone's approaching or someone is trying to do something funny, they might be able to detect it.
Yeah, exactly. So let's see some other questions and then we'll stop for today. So I'll be guessing about 60% mechanical parts in the server, use quite a lot of energy. Yep, I agree with that. Ram says, can you please confirm cost fee? So Ram, I'm trying to get your question. What do you mean by cost fee? So I don't get like the cost fee. So if you're talking about this cost, are we charging anything for that? Not at the moment. Again, Ram, you have no idea who I'm talking to. I'm right now in the presence of Sir Kofi. If you know exactly who this man is, you will not be saying that. Talking about one of the richest men. So, anyways, so Sir Kofi, I'll hand over to you now. So, what is the assignments that we have for people this week? What's the homework? We don't have anything, not for this week, but for this one. So we don't have anything really complex, just something light. And then the next one will actually start with some heavy homework. But what homework do we have for people?
Yeah, it looks like my audio is playing up. So if you don't hear me, David will probably reinforce what I'm going to say. Yeah. So essentially, the homework for today is more to set up your own Azure subscription essentially. So we give you a link, portal.azure.com, where you can actually set one up. I think normally they will give you a few credits that you can run for probably a month, which will give you the ability to, have a look around essentially.
Yeah, very good point, Sir Kofi. So that is what we're going to be. Oh, sorry, apologies. So people say can hear. So what Sir Kofi just said is the homework that we have for you for today. So we're going to be stopping now. But the homework that we have for you for today is make sure you have an Azure subscription. Make sure you have an Azure subscription ready. So because what happens is we're going to pick things up on Monday, and on Monday we're going to start talking about identity. But in order for you to follow with the labs that we're going to be giving you to do, so every single session will have an homework, will point you to a lab to do, and will give you the video recording to follow. And if you follow through with us, right, you'll be in a very strong place to pass your Azure Administrator Certification exam, because you'll have gained so much knowledge, you'll have gained so much hands-on experience that you'll be busting forth with a lot of Azure information, and you'll be in a very great place. So that's the homework, is sign up for an Azure free trial subscription if you do not have one. So please do that. And just a reminder of what we have coming up and the timetable and the calendar. So the timetable and the calendar is we have identity next. So we didn't quite finish like the agenda for today, but what we'll do is the last point of the agenda, which is Azure Management Tools. I can talk about that at the beginning of our next session together, which is on Monday. But on Monday, we're going to focus on Azure Identity, which is we're going to start looking at Azure AD. And then Tuesday, next week, we're going to look at governance and compliance. And Wednesday, we're going to look at more at governance and compliance. Again, broken down into 2 sessions. So at the end of this, you have very strong understanding of what we're talking about. Okay, so Sir Kofi, are you doing giveaway today?
Not today, maybe
No problems, man. So over to you, Sir Kofi, because you are a wonderful host. So thanks very much for hosting us today.
Yeah. So I seem to have an issue with my audio. I'm trying to resolve it, but still no good. So I'm thankful for all of you guys joining this session, and hopefully you join the other session that are coming up. We definitely have a lot to talk for you guys. So definitely join in next time, and make sure you if you're not already part of our LinkedIn group or meetup group, make sure you be part of the community, because we definitely spend a lot of content on that community.
Yeah, no problems. So thanks very much for that, Sir Kofi. So for the people that asked the question about the schedule, we'll be sharing the schedule on the LinkedIn and the Meetup group. We'll point that in the description of this video. For the question around the timing, so we understand that unfortunately it's a bit of a tough one for us. So because we have to consider like other things. So the reason is that if you're not able to attend live, this will be all on YouTube for you to rewatch the session at a later time. So we'll also be rearranging some times, maybe do some Saturday. So I do understand your question, Nehemiah. So I think that we'll look at that and we'll see how we can put some more sessions on Saturday at a similar time. But for now, thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. Have a nice time. No problems at all. Thanks very much. Bye for now.
Bye.